When you work in education leadership, you don't get off at 5 o'clock. Your mind is always on the clock, thinking of ways to solve problems for your students, parents, and teachers. On the Clock is your go-to podcast to learn valuable insights from education leaders across the United States. I'm your host, Todd Dallas Lamb, former White House appointee to the U.S. Department of Education, and we are now on the clock. Welcome back to On the Clock. I am your host, Todd Dallas Lamb, and as you may have noticed if you're a regular listener, a lot of our podcasts this week have been filmed and taped in Glendale, California at the Age of Learning Education Advisory Council and Thought Leadership Forum. And so myself and my partner, Addison Davis, have been out here interviewing thought leaders in education from across the country all week, and I'm really pleased to have run into someone from my home state of Maryland this week, Dr. Sharon Pepukayi.
That's correct.
It's not an easy name to memorize, but I did it. I'm so proud of myself. She's from Talbot County.
There you go.
Those of us in Maryland are always correcting people. It's sort of like the Maryland version of Nevada. And I thought I'd sit down and talk with her and hear her story. Talbot County is a fascinating history of America, and so I thought I'd combine a couple of areas. One of the things I've been listening to amongst leaders this week, I'm hearing a lot about early reading.
Yes.
And I'm hearing a lot about the science of reading matched up with that.
Yes.
That's a passion for you, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And then, as you know, with the Maryland Blueprint, one of the first pillars is early childhood, but there's a thread of reading throughout. And with our new state superintendent having the science of reading be a highlight, that's something we are focusing on. But we had already trained our teachers in the science of reading before that was a thing that we all had to go to.
So I'm a bit of a historian, and one of my favorite figures in all of American history, all of human history, is Frederick Douglass, who's also from Talbot County.
Yes.
You went to St. Michael's High School in Maryland, correct?
I did. Graduated from St. Michael's High, went to Frederick Douglass Elementary School.
Yeah. So I just read, not too long ago, a little bit about him that I never knew, which was he was sent to Baltimore, where he was a slave to a family in Baltimore, and a woman taught him how to read. She could tell very early that he was very smart. She didn't know that it was against the law to teach a slave to read. And she only taught him, wait for it, phonics. She taught him sounds, very sight words, very small words, and she learned very quickly that she shouldn't be doing that. And that Frederick Douglass heard the husband tell her that he can't be a slave if he learns how to read, and he was committed to learning how to read. It really is the thing that unlocks almost everything. For him, he goes on to do some pretty spectacular things like start the North Star, an abolitionist paper. He escaped slavery. I even recently learned that he was invited as a guest speaker for the Seneca Falls women's suffrage movement in 1848. Dude was worried about women voting even before slavery was outlawed. It really is an incredible legacy in your district, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I'm a quote person, and we just celebrated Frederick Douglass Day. The Frederick Douglass Honor Society is a group that holds multiple events for Frederick Douglass and awards scholarships to our high school students for college and beyond, whatever they want to do. But during that day, a lot of people stood up that were part of the ceremony, and they recited quotes and other things. And there was a through line. So when I got up, I talked about the through line of all of his quotes, all of his teachings. It was the foundation of education. At every chance he got in front of people, it was to educate them on what we could do better, what we could do for others, that was grounded in education. And so that was the whole day, and the whole day were education activities for us to learn more about what we could do.
The reform movement during that time, anti-slavery certainly gets a lot of ink, and it should. Women's suffrage gets a lot of ink, and it should. But public school as a concept was one of those reforms, wasn't it?
It was, and that's, we been talking as a network of superintendents, and we always talk about what is it that we can take off the table, add onto the table, and we think about it. It sounds so easy, but we know how schools were formed, the industrial age, the calendar that we have, and it seems so easy to say, well, let's just get rid of it. But then we keep talking about all the layers that we have to cut through to be able to do that, to get to the actual reform that's needed for public education. And sometimes, I mean, right now, public education takes a hit depending on the organization or the group that you're talking about.
Right.
But for me, and for the district I'm in Talbot, it's telling our narrative, telling our story, telling the facts, and being very transparent in the work.
If you've ever lucky enough to drive through Annapolis, over the Bay Bridge, into what is known as the Eastern Shore, Talbot County is one of the counties there, and it's incredibly bucolic, farmland, lots of water, lots of boats, and you might think it's agricultural, it has a slave past. It's really transformed into something really incredible as a community. There's a lot of people that live there as a second home. To talk about Easton and Talbot County and St. Michael's a little bit.
Well, growing up in my family, my dad's from Talbot County, my mom's from Washington, but my granddad had a seafood business. So early on, the Valiants, well-established family there on the shore in Bellevue, an old historic African-American community. And that's where, so he sold my grandfather land right there on the water. My grandfather started a seafood company, and back then, one of the very few African-American seafood owners. Built his boats from scratch, built my dad's uncle. And so we had a seafood business where we had a crab house, we had an oyster house.
Wow.
And so that began the legacy of Black Waterman. There's a Maryland Public Television show around the Black Waterman.
Yep.
And so that was my, growing up. Now, my mom was a teacher, retired from Caroline County. So I knew all along education was what I wanted to do. I wanted to help others, not just with public education, but in the community as well, and helping those whatever they needed to get ahead.
Mm-hmm. I'll switch topics just slightly. A huge issue in the last few years is how we teach American history. Mm-hmm. You are in, I like to say that Frederick Douglass is the greatest American story of all time because it encapsulates all that is wrong with America and all that can be with America. How is your community dealing with that issue? I know that that's an issue. Americans, they always say that Americans don't like to talk about the bad stuff. I don't think anybody likes to talk about the bad stuff. But we have to understand where we came from if we're going to know where we're going, right?
Absolutely. And so just it was Constitution Day.
Yeah.
And I was invited to the art museum, and they had reenactors of Thomas Jefferson and Frederick Douglass.
Yep.
And they stood up and they gave their own accounts of history, and we had students there. But there were only a select group of students. What we want to do is open that up so that all students can hear Thomas Jefferson's thoughts, Frederick Douglass, and all these historical figures that added so much to American history.
Fast forward, Terrence Bailey, who is a descendant of Frederick Douglass, is also in the community trying to build, things for students to do, because I think what's missing, and I could say do a better job, is our students to learn and be in the space to learn history.
Yeah.
And I always say, would a student buy a ticket like they would a movie ticket to a social study or a history teacher's class?
Yeah.
And that's what we have to do. We have to reenact what those places, people, events, and programs were like then to grab students and be engaged in it.
And I also think perspective is it's really easy to put a lens on of today. I wouldn't want anybody to see how my dad raised me, let alone 200 years ago.
Right, exactly.
And I feel like that perspective gets lost in the conversation.
Yes, and I think the more because everybody has stories to tell.
And from their history. I think that needs to happen more. I
Yeah.
think the debates and the discussion through Socratic method in classrooms for students need to happen more, because that's when you hear the stories, you have the connections. When you have the connections, you retain it more.
Yeah. Talbot County School Districts, what's the makeup of demographics?
So we're just about 5,000, 26% Hispanic, which is our second under white population, and then about 18% African American, and then the rest other. But fastly growing are Hispanic families.
Yep.
And so for us, it's finding out what we can do to meet those needs. I talk to all my new teachers when they come. 15 minutes, I ask them 2 questions. What's going well? What can we do better? Mm-hmm. Hands down, they say, I feel like I can't meet the needs of my students that are coming into my classroom that can't speak the language.
Right.
They're coming into the classroom and I feel like I don't have what I need. So that's hands down the one thing that I hear.
How do you,
it's needed.
That just got said to you. Now where do you go? What do you do?
So right now, I immediately said we need a task force.
Yep.
You know, everybody that's closest to the work, let's come together. Recommendation, and we're looking at some models in other places in the state. Anne Arundel is one of them. A welcome center.
Yep.
Where families and students can come off the bat. They come, we find out where they are academically, we find out the needs of the family, do everything a one-stop shop.
Yep.
And then we can say, okay, now this is where we want you to go. Versus figuring out, like, putting them in the place and then trying to spin our wheels and try to figure it out.
Right. Anne Arundel, led by Mark Bedell,
Yes.
like one of the coolest
Yes.
former basketball players.
Yes.
I know. He seems like he's doing great
Yes.
in Anne Arundel. And
Great person I can tap into.
yeah,
as
there's
well as
some
a lot.
fun superintendents in Maryland.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we meet every month, and it's just great coming together and coming up with our ideas, suggestions, venting a little bit,
Yep.
but also doing some problem solutions.
Do you think Frederick Douglass would be thrilled to meet our governor, the first African American governor in the state's history?
I do. He's full of energy. He's innovative. So I do think they would have a really robust conversation.
My son met him for the very first time about a year and a half ago.
Okay.
And I said, be prepared to see the most energetic human being,
Yes.
the most charismatic politician I have ever met. And I have met hundreds of politicians, 4 presidents,
Okay.
100 governors, and 1,000 legislators. I've never seen anything quite like him. And I think he and Frederick would get along quite nicely, don't you?
And he's come to the shore quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I just happen to not be or have somewhere else I am when he's there. So I'm hoping to meet him one day.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
One last thing I got to note on this podcast, On the Clock, I talk about football a lot. I compare your job to like an offensive coordinator. And
Wow.
I'm a huge Ohio State football fan,
Yes.
and I think you're the first guest on my show that went to the Ohio State.
The Ohio
I noticed
State.
on your bio you put the Ohio State.
You have to
on
say
your-
the THE before.
Sharon, thank you so much for being on the clock. You're now
It's
off
a
the
pleasure.
clock, and really enjoyed getting to know you this week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.